Hi, my name is Greg Canty, and I'd like to welcome you to the Win Happy podcast. I love chatting to people from all walks of life about their lives and their careers, about the choices they make along the way to pursue their happiness, and what winning actually means to them. I hope you enjoy these conversations as much as I do. Thanks for listening. On today's podcast, I welcome back urban planner, journalist and political commentator Paul Kearns to the podcast. Paul is living in Tel Aviv with his partner and his two young girls and finds himself once again literally in the eye of the storm as the war with Iran is in its fourth week. Bomb alerts are now part of everyday life for the family, and as he says himself, you never get used to that sound. He chats about the impact of the war, in particular on his young girls, and the long-term effect on the next generation, who are growing up with harsh memories and the inevitable hatred for the other side. Paul explains the mood in Israel and why support for what I believe is an unnecessary war has increased since it began. Discussing war on a podcast about happiness might seem very strange. Unfortunately, life goes on, even when the bombs are falling. I hope you enjoyed the show. Hi, Paul. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back so soon.
No conversation between us should start with you just missed an alarm. And you're not talking about someone's car going off or someone's hit a football against someone's window in a house down the road or anything like that. When you talk to me about an alarm has just gone off or I've just missed one, what are you talking about?
Okay, I'll explain for your listeners what happens in Israel when a missile is fired from Iran. First of all, your phone, and you have no choice on this. This is not an app you download. This takes over your phone. Your phone alerts you to a piercing noise that missiles have been fired. Then you have a little bit of silence before the deafening, and you just don't get used to this, the deafening sound of bomb alert sirens all over the street, all over the country, in effect. I mean, it exists in every built-up area, and that takes control of, your entire being. And that goes off for a minute or so. Then you have another minute of silence, and then the explosions. And in that few minutes, you are supposed to get to a personal war room, a mamad it's called. Most new apartments have one. Or if you're living in an old apartment, which is true for Tel Aviv, many apartments, you have to go to a communal underground shelter, and it takes, you run there in 2 minutes. And then you just wait for the booms, and the booms are deafening. There are explosions of intercepted Iranian cruise missiles above your head. And you come out again, and that's it. And you immediately check the news, friends first, family, if you're not with your kids or, different loved ones. Are you okay? And then you go to the news and check what's hit or what might have been hit. And sadly, the deaths are creeping up. They're nothing obviously like the horror that we see in South Beirut or the 1,500 deaths in Tehran. But they're creeping up. And they're low because most Israelis have access to bomb shelters. What has happened in the last week is that Iran has chosen to use what's called cluster bombs. And the cluster bomb is basically dozens of small bomblets inside a missile, and they break up in the sky. So the Israeli Iron Dome can't hit these because it would, they require dozens of iron domes. And these fall over a very wide area. And I think I told you before, Israel at its narrowest point is 12 kilometers wide. So some of these cluster bombs would actually have a trail of 10 kilometers long and a kilometer wide. And they would, when they fall, they would destroy a car or the top apartment of a building. So there's been deaths on those. And sadly, there was just the other night, 4 Palestinians, which wasn't really reported too much in the news in Ireland or Britain, 4 Palestinians in the West Bank, in the occupied West Bank. 4 girls, 4 women, 2 girls and 2 women were killed by a cluster bomb.
I actually did see that, as it turns out. I couldn't tell you where. So we're chatting on a Friday. I'm busy working away. It's lunchtime here, and a normal day, just getting through my to-do list and some meetings with clients online, where Dee is doing exactly the same. We'll go for a stroll with the 2 dogs on the beach a little bit later and get on with our life and head into the weekend and all that kind of thing. You're sitting there. Are people working?
They are and they aren't. You know, when you can work from home, you're allowed to work from home. Schools are closed for the last 3 weeks, which means the kids are with you practically most of the time. It's odd, you know, the traffic is very low, but coffee shops are open. And so, I mean, I was coming back from a bomb shelter and people were sitting outside within minutes having wine. It's a sight to see Israelis drinking wine because they don't drink much, but I don't know, it's an odd, surreal, the whole thing is terribly surreal.
Is that a case of, well, que sera, what can we do? Let's go for a cuppa, let's have a glass of wine, and let's hope that the Iron Dome or all these anti-missile protectors, whether they do work or they don't, let's cross our fingers and hope for the best.
Yes, I mean, when the alarm, they wouldn't be sitting having a glass of wine when the alarm goes off. And if you get a notification to go back, you can leave the shelter. So Israelis, or I guess anybody, I believe the same in the United Arab Emirates, these alarms or sirens, people trust them. So when they say it's safe to go out, people go out. And I guess people have been living under a war scenario for 2.5 years. Missiles of varying size and various intensity of periods. You know, it's a fact of life. So while people are exhausted, and I think I said this to you before, you never get used to these alarms going off or the sounds of missiles exploding above your head. But the average Tel Avivian will have heard this thousands of times in 2.5 years.
So you're living there with your partner and your 2 young girls. So you said schools are closed. So are they in the house with you at the moment?
They're out now at the moment. People go out and play. The playgrounds, it's a sight to behold. The playgrounds are full, and then you see or you hear the alarm on your phone and you look from the balcony and the kids run in. I'm not at home at the moment. I'm in their grandmother's house. We left our home. I haven't slept in our apartment. We haven't slept in our apartment in 3 weeks because our apartment in Tel Aviv doesn't have a war room, a mamad. And the choice is to stay overnight in the communal shelter on a sleeping bag with hundreds of others, which people do, or find friends or family who have a war room. The grandmother does. She's a newer apartment and she's in the distant suburbs. There's also a psychological, perhaps foolish belief that if you're in the distant suburbs, you're less vulnerable. And I think that statistically is probably true, but people get hit all over the country. But the center of Tel Aviv, where we live, is a prime target.
So you get that alarm or that alert in your phone with the piercing sound, and I presume the kids, when they're out playing with their buddies or whatever, they don't have phones, do they?
The kids are too young, so we'd never have them out alone under this environment. But you see, like 12-year-olds, the eldest daughter is 9. I see 9 or 10-year-olds, the equivalent of 9 or 10-year-olds, in the park playing, kicking the football around, and they all must have close access to a phone because when you hear your phone going off, you see they begin to run.
So your girls, do they know instinctively? So boom, we need to go home now.
Yeah, once my phone goes off, they run into the war room, before the alarm goes off. And they tell you, come on, get in. And then you go into the room, and it's a bedroom. It's the bedroom in an apartment, but the walls are reinforced and steel windows that are permanently locked because of the situation. And then you have to close this massive steel door with this massive handle, and you lock it down, and you hear the sound of the apartments above you and below you, them doing the same, this kind of clink, clink, clink all above, because all the war rooms in each apartment are on top of each other.
And your girls, Paul, again for the listeners, how old are they?
They're 3 and 9.
So they've had over 2 years of this. So your 3-year-old, what's her name?
Mia.
Mia. So Mia, her earliest memories of this crazy world we're living in is a bizarre place with sirens and shelters and running inside. And your older daughter, how old is
Ella.
she? You said she's 9.
Ella's 9.
So she's been soaking up this since she's been 6.5, effectively.
Well, the 3-year-old has known this since she was 6 months old, and it's just part of her consciousness, and she's quite afraid of the sounds. No concept of what really they mean other than it's dangerous and it's loud and it's not pleasant. A 9-year-old knows what war is, and it's understandable. She's more chilled and is quite protective of her 3-year-old. But actually last night, and I say this, it's a personal story, but I keep coming back to you, as I said, to capture a moment in time that they can listen to over the various 2.5 years. And she had a very emotional evening with myself and my husband. She cried a lot. She didn't want to live here. She wants to live in Ireland. She's been there many times. I said she wants to get out of here because of the war. And it's heart-wrenching. And actually, as I talk, we're trying to get out just for a break, but it's proving impossible. We might have to go over the border to Egypt and travel from Egypt, which has its own risks as an Israeli family. But the airport is closed and we can't get out. We did book a flight, but it was cancelled.
God almighty. Has she witnessed anything now, other than the loud noises and having to go into the shelter and going into hiding? Has she seen buildings around the city that have been hit? And God almighty, and I hope she hasn't. Has she witnessed anything more, like people in serious trouble or anything like that?
No, she hasn't. She hasn't seen. I mean, the internet is full, and I wrote an article last week about this. The internet is full of crazy conspiracy. I don't know if you can call them conspiracy theories, but theories that Tel Aviv has been destroyed, or that vast areas of the city have been destroyed, and these are widely circulated, and they're actually shared by many people. And George Galloway, of all people, many readers will know, the ex-Labour and Respect. He's a fringe figure, he's a political figure, but he represents a certain viewpoint, and he did get elected, I think, when I was researching him, 5 times with different political parties. He shared this insane Facebook post that Tel Aviv now looks like Gaza and that Israel had been destroyed, and he knows because he's friends in the center of the city. There's been one very bad hit in the city that some people were killed and destroyed 2 buildings, and the damage is for superficial damages, over a wide area, glass breakage, etc., and cars burnt out. That was one. But the city is still here. People are going for coffee.
Wouldn't you love to sit your daughter down next to a girl of similar age in Cork and let them have a chit chat about their experiences and their lives and what they're up to with their friends and what their interests are? So you'd struggle to even get into her head and the things that she's witnessed.
She knows this isn't normal, and when I say normal, it's normal for her, and it happens. But there's been quiet, or relatively quiet, since the last Iran war. So we haven't had the sirens go off since, if I can recall, since last June, since the 14-day war with Iran. This is now 3 weeks long, and the sirens are going off, the bomb alerts and the missiles are coming in pretty regularly for 3 weeks. We obviously try not to show anything on the television one, but sometimes you get a glimpse of something because you want to know. I mean, I'm writing for newspapers and she might walk in, but she hasn't seen anything disturbing or horrific.
Okay. Obviously, this isn't very good. You've witnessed the changes in her. She's saying very clearly to you now, might be a good idea to get out of here, Dad. A very practical child, I would be suggesting, Paul. Your life and that relationship with your partner, how is all of this changing you, and what is it doing to you? Because it's quite a different world to what you would have had a couple of years ago living over there.
This is the whole crazy stuff about war and how surreal it is. It's hard for me to judge how it has affected our relationship, but you have a glass of wine in the evening, you're watching Netflix. You're watching, you're watching, you're binge watching something on Netflix, drinking wine, and then the alarm goes off. So like normal life continues in between the craziness of war. He works as an architect for the city of Tel Aviv, and next Wednesday he has to be there 12-hour shift in case buildings are hit. And they have to then supply the drawings of the buildings that are hit to the fire service. So the various architects, engineers, or planners have these kind of 12, 18-hour shifts between them in case there's an emergency. I'm writing for newspapers, and by the time your listeners hear this piece, I hope to have two pieces this Sunday, very different. One on life in the United Arab Emirates, which are going through similar difficulties, and another on the kind of the mood here and the craziness of just the whole experience of it. And I use that word surreal all the time. How the television communicates what's going on. There's a little bit of, I wouldn't say dissent, but a little bit of greater questioning of the whole purpose of this, the objective of it on the news. When my Hebrew is still bad enough not to follow everything, but when the various guests or pundits are screaming at each other, that there's disagreement. And the government remains very unpopular and it hasn't received the war bonds. But people are asking, like everybody is asking around the world, what's the objective here? And how do we know what we're achieving? And it's hard to answer. I'm usually a little optimistic when I come onto your podcast, but I'm a little bleak because the mood in Israel for the people and also the government, and the government is unpopular, is that any war or this war with Iran is existential. The mood for the regime in Iran is that this war is existential for the regime. Perhaps the only difference is that the people in Iran who are arguably suffering, dare I say it, even though I'm sitting in Tel Aviv with kids, more than here, do not share that view. But the reality is the regime in Iran believes this war is existential, and the regime in Tel Aviv and the Israeli people believe this war is existential. My fear is Trump could decide in 4 days' time, we won, the war is over, and great, let him decide that. My fear is that Iran and Israel will decide, sorry, we're not playing ball. We'll continue.
I think that's a very realistic proposition.
Yeah, the objectives are unclear. They change, and they have changed all the time. Here was the nuclear program, and that's such a muddy area in terms of knowledge, even for the experts. Then it was the ballistic missile program, and these are reasonable things that Israelis want destroyed, especially the ballistic missile program when rockets are landing over your head. But it's 3 weeks now that the missiles are still coming in. Regime change was talked about. Most Israelis, most people around the world think that's unlikely, if not nonsense. The piece I did actually for this coming Sunday was trying to tap into the zeitgeist of, there's an Israeli view and a government view that the great people of Persia and the great people of Judea, the Jews and the Persians, are the two ancient people of the Middle East, and that the Arabs and Islam or Johnny-come-latelys, they arrived late. And that really the Jewish people and the Persian people have historic connections. And so there's this fundamental belief in government and across Israeli society that the real Persia has to emerge from the Islamic impostor, and the great Jewish people of the Middle East and the great Persian people of Persia have a lot in common. And so I was talking about Cyrus the Great, which I have to confess I didn't know much about, but he's in the article on Sunday. Cyrus the Great is a great Persian leader who liberated the Jews from Babylon and allowed them return to Judea to build a temple. You have many Jewish holidays that connect with ancient people of Persia. And while all this might sound bizarre, absurd, fantastical, or irrelevant, it's actually in the consciousness of Israelis that they have a connection with Iranians, which would they will call, well, of course they'll call them Iranians, but they, would call them Persians. So you see on the news, the Israeli news showing the bombing of Iran with empathy, as if the bombing was coming from somewhere else.
Yeah, nothing to do with us.
Nothing to do with us, and a kind of sense that, and they will show, as to be fair to Israeli news TV, as every other news channel across the world will show, they will show some of the images from the wealthier parts of North Tehran, where there's cheering when Ayatollah Khamenei was killed, or Larijani, or all these leaders were killed, and people are banging pots and whistling out of windows and celebrating. We all see that, and Israelis have shown that too. But they actually do show the imagery of parts of Tehran being hit. And I think I said this before, many parts of the Middle East, they kind of look the same, breeze block buildings. So you wouldn't know whether the images are showing are Tel Aviv or Tehran. They have never, ever shown images of Gaza City with the same level of empathy.
So that's a totally different thing, which is really incredible and really bizarre. For all of that conversation we're having, Paul, with you and where you are, your partner, your two kids, you are in the suburbs, you do have access to that protection of, that house with the bomb shelter, and you're not witnessing things to the same degree. And I don't want to diminish it for 1 second, but you are hearing the bombs and that threat and that discomfort and all of that. There obviously is another Paul sitting in Tehran with his two kids and his partner, and they don't have all of those protections, and they're in all likelihood witnessing for real the net effect of the bombing, including buildings and destruction, and I'm sure bodies here and there and everything else. So it's all degrees, isn't it? And of course, I'm in West Cork, happy out. and not to make fun of it, but I've been asking you about your daughters and your 9-year-old, and she's been witnessing this for 2.5 years. If you take that and you up the ante on it, and, she's witnessing an awful lot more, like destruction and dead bodies and relatives and everything else, the effect on her, or any young child, and what that child will bring with them in 5 years, 10 years, like for all of this war, what it's stirring up for decades to come is generations and generations of hatred and the terrorists of tomorrow, because it's gone so deep into their psyche. Like it's very distressing from a world point of view, what we're producing now for the future, for your daughter's future, and the kids in Gaza or the kids in Tehran or Beirut, whatever. You're up close and personal, you're seeing the effects of it on your child. Can you even imagine what it's going to be like if that's even more in your face, that murder and destruction?
Of course, the hate is understandable, and, I'm sure there's tens of thousands of children across the Middle East who are traumatized at the moment. Millions, really, when you think of what they see from their parents, what they say 25 million people are displaced. 25 million. Technically, I'm displaced. I'm in a comfortable apartment in the suburbs, but I haven't slept in my own bed in 3 weeks. 500,000 in Beirut are displaced. 25 million people is the estimate that are not sleeping in the home that they were 3 weeks ago. The children, no matter what's communicated to them, whether they have parents who can provide a more holistic view of the world and understanding that hate will not enter their consciousness, can see disruption. They can feel, they can see what's happening around them. And for millions more, tens of millions the trauma, the fear, the nightmares. She keeps on saying she's nightmares. She fears people are going to come into the apartment and take her away, which might come back to the whole hostage thing in Gaza. So we're definitely generating a lot of hate for sure, but we're generating vast amount of trauma for millions of children just in the last 3 weeks alone.
Our conversations, you're from Dublin. You have been living out there for quite a while. You were working in urban planning in Dublin. You've been there now for how many years?
Permanently since 2016, 18, around then.
Okay. And our first conversations were about COVID and what it looks like in urban planning in cities, because you wrote some amazing pieces that we read here on the Irish Times. And then, of course, the war started with Gaza. 7th of October sparked everything, and then we had everything that followed. And you quite bravely were writing very, very loudly about what it was like inside Israel in Tel Aviv and how the media were bending the story in a particular way. And you put a big spotlight on it. We then had a conversation about the 12-day war, where you were absolutely in the eye of the storm, going to the bomb shelters within Tel Aviv in your proper home, I guess. And that finished, and I could sense the relief. Of course, Trump was, as usual, we obliterated Iran's nuclear capability, and it was all cheering and rah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. And you must have thought, Paul, thanks be to God, maybe we can get back to something that's approaching normality. Did you believe that? Did you actually believe things can calm down now and maybe we'll get a window of just normal life? Or did you have a sneaky suspicion that this could kick off any day now?
To be honest, I think every Israeli felt that another war with Iran was inevitable. How soon was uncertain. The devastation in Gaza has made the possibility of rockets coming in from Hamas practically impossible. The war with Hezbollah ended in 2024, and I think there was greater fear about Hezbollah, given its proximity in Lebanon and the extent of they're armed by Iran, what they could do to Israel and the timeframes of missiles coming in. And there was some hair-raising articles in Israeli media. If Hezbollah unleashed its arsenal of missiles, the death toll could be in the tens of thousands in Israel. But we were told, or we believed, Hezbollah had been largely decapitated or disabled, or its missile capability destroyed, and yet it chose to join the war again. And the north of Israel is subject to missiles from Hezbollah. But the Iranian one, I guess, it's a combination of knowing the capacity of the technology and regime in terms of its power and missile capability. And these missiles are, they're pretty terrifying in terms of the scale of damage when they get through. But I think it's the regime's ideological bent, and it has made it clear for decades that it wants Israel destroyed. And it's the language that can often get missed in this when you, or the equivalent of me who are living in Dublin, is reading the news or reading, watching RT or Channel 4 News or New York Times, and it's all the language of geopolitical calculations and strategic this and oil prices and all this kind of abstract language of international politics. There's a belief, a regime not so far away, once you're dead, and the country destroyed. And it permeates your sense of being. And we're under no illusion that the Iranian regime has been using the Palestinian cause to benefit its own, how shall I say, capacity to reach out to the Middle East and uphold its own sort of power structure in Iran. I mean, Iranians are Persian, they're Shiite. Most of the Arab world is Sunni, and they're Arab. So there's a disconnect there, and there's great tension between the Arab world and Iran, as we saw with the war with Iraq. And I don't know how the Gulf states, or those who live in the Gulf states, will ever, in the near decades, psychologically trust Iran again. The damage between this regime and the Arab world is phenomenal in this 3-week war. But Israelis, yeah, they started with the United States, in their view, the government's view, a preemptive strike. And at the time, the country was divided 50-50. 50% believed. There was a poll taken just before the war. 50% supported a preemptive strike, whatever that meant. 50% said no, they didn't support that. And it was if war breaks out, that's different. Within a week, they managed to have another opinion poll, and it was 83% supported the war. And that went as high as 92% for Jews and 26% for Palestinian citizens of Israel.
And are you talking this war, not the 12-day war?
Sorry, this war. Yeah, this war.
Okay, so my question to you was, when that 12-day war finished, did you actually think there was going to be a bit of normal life for a while, or did you think we were going to be back here again so quickly?
Well, it's 9 months. It's hard to know whether that's quick.
And if you had asked me, was it 9 months, I would say not a chance. It was a couple of months. It felt like only yesterday that we were talking about it. But it obviously was 9 months. You're living there. Okay. When did you know, God Almighty, this thing has started again?
We knew in Israel a week before this started that it was going to happen. In fact, I'm not connected to privy information, but I sent a couple of articles to Irish newspapers 4 days beforehand, saying this is going to happen and this is the mood here, and the newspapers got back and said, we'll deal with it if and when it happens. And so you knew it, and we start packing a bag, like a small suitcase of the kids' clothes, for 3 or 4 days. We start buying, as most Israelis did, biscuits, tins of tuna, bottled water, and you had bags of those in the hall. 3 days, 4 days before the war, we knew it was going to happen. We were alerted, as like the last war, by the government, who sent an alarm to our phones, not that the missiles were coming in, but that they had started, in effect, a preemptive attack on Iran, and that it was inevitable, that missiles were coming in the next day or so.
And is that how you knew? Because people were alerted in advance?
They were alerted literally at the same time as the Israeli Air Force struck Iran.
Okay, but you knew a little bit before that, is what you're saying?
No, I couldn't have known, but the mood on the ground in Tel Aviv was just absolutely certain. And it comes through all sorts of rumors, some, very informed, as in, I know somebody in the Air Force who's been called up.
Okay.
Things like this. And everybody, somebody in the Army or the Air Force, I see the anti-missile battery, like things happen. But I guess you guys knew too, in the sense that the American naval war machinery had been put in place.
Yeah.
But there was a genuine sense in the 3 or 4 days, 5 days before, that it was 95% certain going to happen very soon.
Were you cursing the Israeli government when this happened again in Netanyahu? Or from what you're saying there with the surveys, that for the most part, the Israeli population are all for what's happening?
It's a great question. I'm cursing the reality of what's happening, and I question the logic of it, and I question the lack of clarity on objectives and how they move constantly, and the trauma that it's causing Israelis, the death toll it has caused in Lebanon and Iran. Can I second question the Israeli military political establishment's belief that this preemptive attack on its missile capability is keeping my children safer? I don't know. One positive thing for your listener, one positive thing for me is that the government hasn't increased a single seat in popularity in the opinion polls. So there's no war bounce, which there usually is across any country after an attack. If you look at historic polls, George Bush, in the months after September the 11th, his popularity hit 90%. I mean, that's just, there's no bounce for Trump because America may be so polarized, but there's no bounce here. So the government remains as unpopular as it has for the last 3 years and will lose an election by reasonably good margin, and the election has to be held before October.
So the clock is working against poor Bibi.
Well, I don't doubt that Bibi Netanyahu, he's had two lifelong obsessions, and he's a central figure in Israeli politics since the late 1980s when he was an ambassador in Washington. He's been the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history. He's in his late 70s. He's had two lifelong obsessions. One is Iran and its nuclear capability, and the other is to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. And he has effectively acted upon those, especially in the last decade or so. But the clock is ticking for him. An election has to be called 3 months before it's due. So he will call an election as soon as this war over, whether it's in 5 days or 4 weeks. I think an election will be called. I don't think I'm an optimist here. I just reading the room of the Israeli society. People are exhausted. I think people want to turn a page. They might support the war in the sense that they believe this is an existential war, and people rally around the flag, but they're not rallying around the government. And it's extraordinary to see the country split before the war and then 80%, 90% supporting the war now, and the government and the Likud party not gaining a single seat in the opinion polls. I just think people want to move on.
The increasing support for the war, you mentioned a lower number and now that's a higher number. Why have people changed their opinion?
The short answer is I don't know, but I think your guess is as good as mine. When a country's at war, there's a rallying around the flag. The Israeli army, the Israeli Air Force, everybody's kid, everybody goes into the Navy or the Army or the Air Force. The country is vulnerable. Missiles are coming in, they're exploding above your head. So it's perhaps understandable that it might spike or peak. But that division between that spike in support for a preemptive strike and the absolutely zero movement in support for the government is pretty extraordinary. I think it's a very, in my view, positive sign that this far-right government is on its way out. And, there's no Pollyanna, kumbaya left-wing government coming in, but it is not a religious, far-right, messianic, warmongering government.
Yeah, because our version of it, and yours tuned into this as anything, is that why did you start this thing? And, you deliberately kicked off a war with the help of Donald Trump, or Donald did it with the help of Bibi. You're all in this together. You're after poking a bear that was pretty much on the back foot anyway. But now, everything that you've been saying, when a place gets attacked, everyone just rallies together and you become a champion. So that beast has been woken up in Iran, and the whole world is seeing the effect on it and attacking the different countries in the Middle East and everything. Is there any will there to say, okay, can someone please stop now? And hopefully that'll all just calm down. Or I think what I'm hearing from you is that, there's the appetite really just to keep on going, even though there wasn't any clear rationale for it in the first place, or any great strategy about what to do once it starts or how to finish it at the other side.
I'm not a geopolitical expert, and I am not privy to the inside thinking of the American or Israeli, regime, but I would imagine that Israeli military strategists and the Israeli government had a more strategic view of what they wanted to do or how they wanted to achieve it than Trump. And the belief here, whether it's disputed or dismissed abroad, that Israel just can't wait till Iran gets a bomb, nuclear bomb, or it can't wait till Iran arms itself to the teeth to exact utter destruction on Israel with its missile program, that they have to, preemptively act. That's just something that hangs over every Israeli in their head, and one can question it abroad. But as I said, there's no doubt that this regime wants Israel destroyed. My pessimism comes from, there was a question, I was on News Talk, and they said, how do the Israelis feel about the Straits of Hormuz? And I was like, Straits of Hormuz to Israelis? You're talking, they couldn't give an FUCK. Israel is sufficient in energy. Its energy supply comes from the gas fields of the Mediterranean, which could be hit. Its oil comes from Azerbaijan, a Muslim country, kind of on the periphery of the Middle East, that's an ally of Israel. And solar panels. It's not that there's no spike here in energy prices, gas prices. They're immune. And Iran is immune. The analysis, better than me, they've suffered a decade-long war with Iraq. They can take pain. And the clever analysis is that Iran wants this to continue because they do not want it to happen again 9 months down the road. They want to exact a price, and they're willing to absorb a huge, huge cost in terms of death and destruction. And Israelis are willing to suffer the mental exhaustion and the fear of rockets every night if they feel that, not that the regime will be overthrown, but that the threat has been somehow determined to be reasonably diminished. So the regime in Iran and the Israeli people and the regime in Israel are not looking for a way out. If they feel that they somehow, it's not about winning or losing in terms of some sort of narrative, if they feel that their state is at risk down the line. So the idea that Trump can say, I've won and it's over like he did the last time and we all put up shop, I don't think the Iranians will go along with that. And if the Iranians continue to fire missiles, the Israelis are not going to look for permission from Trump not to fire missiles. So, there's talk already on the radio that oil prices might reach $300 a barrel. There's big winners and losers in this, despite the horror that's happening across the Middle East. You would know well, I can see the headlines in RTE is oil prices, home oil, electricity bills. Ukraine is a big loser. Russia's a big winner. Europe is a big loser. Do Israelis or the Iranians give a toss about Europe or Ukraine? Not right now.
And I would say America seems to be a big loser now. Certainly Donald is. He thought this was going to have the opposite effect, and it seems to be tanking him. It's put a big split in his base with, we've been back and forth with a few defections around the place. There's definitely a big chasm there between his MAGA faithful about America first and now looking for 200 billion to continue this, and all of that crazy rhetoric that's going with it. I know we're talking about the importance of words and everything, but I'm watching the words that are coming out of there. My God Almighty. If you think back to our last conversation and you were saying about how the anti-Semitic conversation that was building in Ireland, and that was our kind of last topic. But when you listen to the Americans, merciful Jesus, when they're talking about Iran, it's like these people need to be, put into a combine harvester and chopped up. And Pete Heck said, we're going to make them toast. Like, wow. You're just after bombing a school and murdering a whole bunch of school children, mainly girls. Not one word of remorse. You're trying to blame the Iranians for it. And if you recall our last conversation, Paul, we were talking about that anti-Semitic dimension. We were also talking about the need for that reputation of Israel to build itself again, even though we kind of thought it was in the gutter after Gaza and everything. And this war with Iran certainly hasn't improved that situation, I would be arguing. So while in Israel, I'm starting to get a clear understanding of it. You don't give a fiddlers about oil supply and everything else to the rest of the world. It looks like Donald has shot himself in the foot. He shot the rest of the world in the foot, yeah, along with that. And it's Israel and Iran will battle it out because of this huge fear and hatred between each other. And I can't see any end to that. You're talking about a preemptive strike. As long as there's 92 million people living there with an increasing level of national identity and hatred, Jesus, that's only going to get worse and not going to get better. I don't know.
Well,
and we're on the Win Happy podcast.
they say the regime has a 5% hardcore support that is dependent on this power structure that exists. And if the regime goes, these families, these individuals lose their power. These numbers, they're very hard to prove, and that there's a huge amount of people who are against the regime, especially abroad. But on the language, the language, no doubt, from Trump and the administration, is vulgar and it's vile at times. But Israelis, they don't forget the language, and it becomes part of the consciousness of Israel. Khamenei saying Israel is a cancer of the Middle East, which I think is a really interesting phrase, because cancer, it has reference to, obviously, disease, vermin, cancer. This is the language Jews have been used against them for thousands of years. And I was in another News Talk interview, and this professor of international studies from Bradford, I can't remember his name, and maybe I shouldn't remember his name, but he says, well, the Iranian regime is not anti-Semitic, it's anti-Zionist. You must remember that there's some Jews in Iran still, and it's just anti-Zionist. And you think, what does that mean today? What does anti-Zionism mean today when the regime says you're the cancer of the Middle East, and they want the entire state and all the Jews who live here destroyed? And they do. So this dancing around the head of a pin of they're not anti-Semitic, they're anti-Zionist, it's just simply bizarre interpretation that Israelis just laugh. And, just getting back to the anti-Semitism and the long conversation we had the last time, I saw when the report came out, the reaction to it, and I've written another piece about the reaction to it in Ireland, but the comments online, it's extraordinary the amount of people who say, I couldn't care less who's Jewish, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist, I hate Israelis. Where is the cognitive dissonance? Half the world's Jews live here. What does anti-Zionism mean today? That it was a historic mistake? Maybe. It shouldn't have happened? Okay. But it's here. It exists. My daughters are Jewish. They live in Israel. What do you mean you're anti-Zionist? Where do you want them to go? They have Moroccan heritage, not European. Well, they both actually.
Yeah.
And I know the intellectual left will say, we mean a democratic state for all. That is not what most people mean. Nobody's interested in the hard business of equality of opportunity, progressive legislation. If that was the case, you wouldn't be using that language. You'd be supporting left-wing Israelis who support that. You'd be supporting Palestinian civil society that supports that. It's not. It's a naive and naked level of hate that is not misinterpreted here. We have to end on a slightly more positive note.
I'm digging deep here now, Paul, and I'm thinking, okay, try to invent something here now, Greg, that can take us into that positive win happy mode. Yeah, listeners might be confused because they think, Christ almighty, Greg, you talk about positive conversations with guests about, and you move there for positive life reasons, and that's amazing. And you're on a wonderful journey with a family, and it's all positive. But real life happens, and in this weird scenario, you're in the eye of the storm. Sorry. So I'd throw the ball back to you. Positivity, the elections.
Well, I think it is positive, and I think we have to look for a little bit of hope where it might exist, that despite what has happened, despite the fear that Israelis have, despite being under constant threat, war, missiles coming in, waking up every morning to destruction and death, etc., that they're not going along with the agenda of this government, and that the new government, as I said, won't be a perfect government, but it will be to the left, certainly less religious in its ideological bent than this one. And Netanyahu, people are just fed up with them, and they're fed up with them for many reasons. And there are some really positive things happening in terms of the possibility of what's happening in the election. And I think I mentioned the last time, the Palestinian Arab parties have come together to form an alliance that will give them a better opportunity to gain a huge amount of seats. And the polls already reflect that. 20% of Israeli society is Palestinian or Bedouin and can vote in the election. And there are some positive parties on the Zionist left, the Jewish left, who are saying the right things and are doing well in the opinion polls. And, I say this to Irish listeners or anybody outside, that when you feel you have so much hate and so much war and feel so existentially vulnerable, to be able to give support to parties or political parties that communicate a bit of hope is a very incredible thing. And yet there is a belief that the next government will be different. And the opinion polls suggest that this is the dying months of Netanyahu's campaign and his career. That's hopeful, no?
Yeah, that is hopeful. And I hope that's reciprocated in the United States of America. And that population in that country will wake up to the clown they have, who they elected as president. I think there's hope that other nations just haven't rolled in behind them enthusiastically. I think being a bit more careful and a bit wise, despite all of his crudeness and everything else. I think in a way, what's happening now in the last couple of years, I think has introduced an awful lot of people into the subject of the Middle East and Israel and Iran, and us being forced to learn and understand and try and figure out what are the issues. Why is there such hatred of Israel and what it must like to be in Israel, knowing that there's 92 million people next door to you who supposedly want you to be wiped off the face of the earth.
I don't like interrupting you, I never have, and you don't interrupt me, but 92 million Iranians do not want Israelis wiped off the face of the earth.
Sorry, that's very true.
And of all nations in the Middle East, there's a strong evidence that the Iranians, despite being subject to a brutal regime of, for 50 years or 40 years, that they're...
It's 20%, isn't it? Isn't it 20%? There's a hardcore...
It's hard to put a number, yeah. But the Iranian regime is an implacable foe of Israel, and yet they say, the population of all the populations in the Middle East, the Iranians, well, let's say they're not pro-Israeli, but they're more pro-Western or empathic to a Western view of the Middle East than many Arab populations who have strong alliance with Israel. So, Egypt and Israel have a peace treaty going back to, the late 70s. And yet if you do opinion polls on Egyptians, they're pretty hostile to Israel. So it's complex. Certainly not all Iranians want, Israel destroyed.
Yeah, and let's hope that this war finishes quickly so that doesn't turn into a country of 92 million haters for both America and Israel because of what they're witnessing every day. Going back to that conversation we're having about your daughters and what they grew up seeing and believing and witnessing, because we need so much less of that in this world and not more of it.
The geography and the history is so complicated. And I learned, I've been first arrived in Israel in 2000, and I've been living here or coming back and forth for 25 years. And I learn stuff every day. I never heard of the Cyrus the Great, to be honest, until a few weeks ago. Yet I learn things every day. But it might astound Irish listeners to know that 5% of Israeli Jews are Persian or have parents or grandparents were born in Iran. 5% is quite a lot. So the connection between these places is phenomenal. And half of all Israeli Jews have direct, I don't mean historical, I mean their parents themselves. My husband is both parents were born in Casablanca. Half all of Israeli Jews have heritage. Either they were born or their parents or grandparents were born in Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Morocco, Algeria. So it's an incredibly complex and interconnected place.
Next to impossible to understand properly and give a valid opinion that isn't being bent left, right, and centre by the news channels that we follow and the algorithm twisted social media accounts that we follow. And in the meantime, Paul, will you, for God's sake, with your partner and your two beautiful children, will you be safe? Trek to Egypt without running into any roadblocks. Try to get a holiday and maybe make it a permanent holiday.
I certainly will. I forgot to mention, I just had one little story that I thought was interesting. I'm not on Twitter or X. I should be as a journalist, but I'm not for my sanity. And I'm on Facebook to share stuff with family in Ireland. And we recently bought rabbits for the kids because we thought it was a good thing to focus them on something else. But one night on the balcony, I decided not to go into the war room foolishly. I just decided I'd go to the balcony and I'd video the sky. So I made a little minute and a half video of the flashes, the booms and the noise and the sirens. And I put it on Facebook and I went to bed. And my journalist articles, pictures of the kids get 10 likes, 20 likes. 4 days later, this had 30,000 likes and 1.3 million views. And it had gone viral in the Middle East.
Oh.
And I had hundreds of friends requests, mainly from men across the Middle East, who erroneously viewed that I was sharing a video of the destruction of Israel, and who were effectively, I have to say, I can't say everybody who watched it did, pleased. And while a lot of the fake imagery of the destruction of Tel Aviv has gone viral, I unwittingly was contributing to some strange conspiracy theory that the country has been destroyed. And the video ended very abruptly with a kind of a shake. And it gave the illusion that either the viewer or somebody was hit.
Had exploded.
I'd run out of space on the phone.
Yeah.
I had too many videos. So I just thought it was bizarre. But yeah, we hopefully we'll get out. And we're conscious, actually, it's terrible to say, but we're very conscious of going over the border to Egypt as an Israeli family, the level of risk there. But we all feel we could deserve a little bit of break and get out for a small amount of time.
I can imagine. And when I'll edit this and we'll publish it, I'll send you a link to it and you can share that in your Facebook account, because I'm fairly sure all of your new followers and friends and all that will be very impressed.
I had to stop because some of the comments coming in weren't so nice, and then I had to protect viewing of the rabbits and stuff, and it all got a bit weird. But yeah, and be careful. Someone might send you on an early holiday. That's not of your choice. Paul, take it easy. Thank you so much for coming on again. Thanks so much, Greg. We'll try. Thanks for listening. All these different, somewhat challenging storylines across. But thanks so much for listening.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Be safe, for God's sake. Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.